Welcome to our third session of the Freedom of Association Summit 2021. This session is titled How to Verify Freedom of Association in the Public Procurement Process. The entire summit is sponsored by the Scottish Procurement Consortium APUC, Advanced Procurement for Universities and Colleges. Thank you for that. Let me make some brief technical points to help you to participate in this session. We are providing interpretation to French and Spanish. So if you need interpretation, please look at the bottom of your Zoom window. You should see a little globe there. If you click on it, you can choose your language. If you need technical assistance, please go to the chat window and select Martina in the chat window and write to her. As a reminder, this session is being recorded and it will be available on our website shortly. My name is Peter Pawlowski. I'm a Director of Outreach and Education at Electronics Watch. I will be leading through this session today. This is already our third day of the summit. On our first day, panelists discussed about the importance of freedom of association and the right to collective bargaining. To be able to address central issues for workers such as occupational health and safety, forced labor, but also the climate crisis, freedom of association is fundamental. Yesterday, we went a step further and asked, what is freedom of association? We discussed with trade unionists, with activists, and with experts from the ILO about the rights that key ILO conventions grant workers. If you missed these two sessions, you're able to watch them already at our website. In today's session, we want to roll up our sleeves and get into the practice of verification and procurement. To take effect, even the most fundamental and important right needs to be implemented. It is always necessary to make sure that rights have been implemented and that this was done in a right way. And similarly for public buyers, the question is always how to verify a specific criteria they have set in their tender and contract conditions. Freedom of association is a much more slippery concept than, say, fire safety. A perspective sensitive to the local environment is necessary. Both regulatory as well as the institutional framing need to be kept in mind. And it is also not so digital as a blocked or not blocked escape way. What is freedom of association in the given circumstances, and how would a realistic but meaningful improvement look like for workers? I'm very happy to be able to discuss these and many more questions with 4 experts in this field. We will hear inputs from Isabelle, Barthes, Stine, Foss, Aykut, Kazanci, and Gopinathan Parakuni today. Welcome to you all, and thank you that you will share with us. I will introduce each speaker in more depth right before their input. We will have time for discussion. We planned Q&A after each input, brief Q&As, and there will be time after the last input. If you want to send your questions during the inputs, you can do this through the chat window by texting to Martina again, Martina Hooper. Or if you want to ask the question directly during the Q&A, you can just unmute yourself and ask away, or you can also raise your hand and then we will unmute you. Today's session will last around 90 minutes until 11:30. Afterwards, if you want to stay on for another half an hour to discuss with our experts, you are happily invited, and this will be a rather more informal discussion. Okay, let's turn to Gopi. Gopi Parakuni has gathered years of experience, and you have been in the field of worker-driven monitoring for years. He's located in India and is a founding member and has been the General Secretary of Citywide since its inception in the year 2000. Gopi is also a member of the Electronics Watch board. Welcome, Gopi. We are looking very much forward to your input, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Peter. Thank you very much. And it's a pleasure to be here today, sharing whatever experiences I have had, mainly in the electronic sector. Organizing, researching in the electronic sector. Let me begin with a little bit of background information about freedom of association in India. We have rather strong labor jurisprudence. I mean, our labor laws follow more or less the British systems, and traditionally we have had very good labor laws. But then they were implemented mostly in public sector companies, and large manufacturing. Also in you'll hear some background noise, I can't help it. Okay? There are vendors going by the way. Okay, so the trade unions were strong in insurance, banking, large manufacturing, plantations, but they have been mostly absent in the new supply chains, whether it is garments, electronics, leather, as also in mining and other global supply chains. So when we talk about freedom of association all over India, it covers just about 8% of the workforce, and they are in the public sector and insurance, but we have hardly any trade unions in the electronic manufacturing sector. The only trade union I came across was in Nokia, which started operating in 2006-07, but unfortunately closed down in 2010-11, so about 6 years or 7 years of its operation. They had several strikes, and ultimately they had a collective bargaining agreement, and there was serious engagement with the trade union within the factory. Even when Nokia closed down, the compensations given to workers were very decent, and they did do training, before the company closed. They did training for workers to find jobs, get into new occupations. Anyway, but Nokia is not in some sectors. Nokia is still there in some narrower fields, but not in a mobile phone manufacturing sector. So with that, I will come to this the difficulty of implementing, or organizing trade unions in the companies. We have a very, managements have anti-trade union orientation, especially in the private sector, a strong anti-trade union orientation, and so this makes it the kind of aggressive, discouraging of any kind of organizing within the factories is a big impediment for organizing workers. And to add to that, the central government has been diluting labor laws steadily. We are going through a very changing phase of dilution of the main trade union laws and workers' rights. Some of the changes have already come in. There are more to come in, and so you have pressure both from private industry managements as well as government, against organizing. So the result is that in the electronic sector, we cannot find any formal trade unions nor collective bargaining agreements. So this is the situation. So how do you engage with workers? How do you monitor whether freedom of association is practiced at all in the companies? It's pretty hard in India in the current situation, but there are some things that public procurers might be able to do. There are some things. Everything is not lost. So there are some things that public procurers outside of India, in Europe and elsewhere, can do. One is that we still have what we call the central trade unions, which of course they do not have members in the electronic industry, but they are strong in other sectors I mentioned earlier. So they have the longest experience in protecting workers' rights. I mean, they have the legal knowledge, they have the analysis of worker situations. So anybody like, basically public procurers who want to understand the labor situation would speak to these central trade unions. We do it in our work, we do it through consultations, where we invite these central trade unions and listen to them. So that is one thing that can be done. And they have the expertise. Secondly, some kind of associational formations is possible in the factories. For example, the Factories Act talks about works committees, canteen committees and other committees. And these are, there is no consequence for not forming these committees, but at least the law talks about these committees. So anybody who wants to engage with the factory managements can ask for evidence of forming these companies, forming these groups, of workers' committees. So whether they have formed these committees, whether they meet regularly, what is their agenda, so it might be possible to check on these. Thirdly, one way to check whether factories are serious about freedom of association and other workers' rights is to see whether they engage in training of workers in basic fundamental workers' rights. Of course, the law doesn't require them to do that, but international companies, procurers can adopt a higher standard and ask factories to see whether, because they are not members of formal trade unions, they don't get an opportunity to understand workers' rights, and it is in the interest of factory managements themselves, that workers understand workers' rights and to engage with them, and of course, it contributes to productivity and all. I need not emphasize that. So that is one other way where one needs to check, whether there is a robust training program on workers' rights. Of course, there are training programs in productivity, in technical skills, all those things. They go on. That is in the interest of the management, but we haven't seen many factories, do any kind of workers' training on their rights, except perhaps occupational health and safety, which we see in some Indian companies as well. Fourthly, I think it is necessary for public procurers to have access to country papers, analysis of the risks in a particular country and in a particular cluster of manufacturing, to have a broader view of how do managements behave, vis-a-vis workers' freedom of association, and what is the strength of workers' organizations. Are there any kind of broader negotiations going on? How do the governments approach workers' rights? Because it can be different in different states as well. So different state governments may have, depending upon their political ideology, they might have different approaches to workers' rights. So it will be very useful for public procurers to get, or ask for country profiles, of workers' rights. Finally, I think, some Indian companies I have seen, not too many, but there are some who are good in terms of occupational health and safety. Some of them also have freedom of association, but it's very rare. As I mentioned, these are very rare companies. Some front runners do have recognized trade unions. And so even if in the electronics companies, if there are no trade unions, one can engage with, I mean, though it will be different sectors. You know, I can say automobiles. You know, there are some companies in automobiles, you know, where there are active trade unions. You know, so I don't know. One can engage with such managements, you know, for advice. You know, advice on, you know, how do they manage kind of freedom of association. You know, what are the actions they take to respect freedom of association, etc. Yeah, I think, you know, yeah, I mean, the final point I want to make is that public procurers, or I mean, public procurers need to brands also need to ask factories to have a program of improvement. You know, it is not a detective job. It is not something like you go in and find out, you know, whether there is freedom of association or not. But ask companies, ask manufacturers to have a program which is incremental. You know, I mean, initially awareness for workers on workers' rights, moving on to associational formations within the companies, you know, and moving on to direct engagement and negotiations. You know, so there has to be a program of improvement over a longer period of time, and they need to be monitored and checked, and companies need to be evaluated against such a incremental progress, a program for incremental progress. So that is all from my part now.
Thank you, Gopi. That was really, really enlightening and very detailed. And I very much like that you basically told us what we actually can already do. So if there are any questions, please do either raise your hand or write them in the chat. What I would like to is somebody no. What I would like to ask you, Gopi, are basically two main things. Do you think there is or do you see a difference between multinational companies? So is there a different approach, say in textiles, than in electronics in India towards union organization, freedom of association, or is it rather this difference you very interestingly explicated between Indian companies and multinational companies?
Yeah, I mean, I see the workers' profile. You know, the workers' profile is different in the garment industry and the electronics industry. In the electronics industry, the workers are a little more educated, you know, and they need to at least read English, you know, have some knowledge of English, at least 10 years in school. So the skills and knowledge that the workers bring and their expectations are higher. You know, and that is also the reason why there is so much of disappointment, you know, among the workers, you know, because they think that it's an industry, it's a very flashy, shining industry. I mean, it has global brands, you know. I mean, everybody uses it, you know, but then, yeah, the conditions are pretty poor, you know, in the factories, you know. So no, I mean, in terms of management's approach to freedom of association, there I don't see any difference. You know, I can only see much more organized and systematic discouragement, you know, of any kind of organizing. Yeah, I won't name the company, but one of the biggest brands, you know, had a handbook given to the workers saying that you cannot join any association. See, this is denial of not only labor rights, this is denial of fundamental human rights. You know, of course they withdrew it. You know, when we pointed out in one of our reports, you know, they were angry, but they did withdrew it. You know, so this is the level of kind of, you know, the approach to trade unions, you know, by even global brands.
Okay. As there are no other questions, I still have a question. One thing that really does make me think is and I think that's kind of the approach we have to increasingly foster is it's not only about, I mean, the goal is to have a union, but in between having no union and having a union, there are a lot of steps. And you talked about these associational forms that are legally allowed in India, and from my understanding, they are very often allowed also in countries like China and in other countries where unions are basically illegal. Could you talk a bit about what kind of committees are this? How can you actually understand if a committee is a good committee or if it's a paper committee or a committee just to communicate what management wants to see?
See, the factory is the territory of the management. You see, it's a little fortress. You know, nobody can enter, nobody can leave without the management knowing. You know, you have surveillance. You have surveillance, in the entire factory in the name of security, but it also serves the purpose of the management in preventing workers from coming together and communicating. Unfortunately, that's the truth. So yeah. So I mean, how do you check that? And I mean, if a company is serious, then it can have these factory committees by various names. Works committees. Canteen committees, works committee is supposed to look at the technical aspects and productivity. So there are, I mean, health safety committees, so these committees were under the earlier Factories Act, and they are still valid now till, I don't know whether they have been removed in the new proposals, but they're still valid. So, I mean, yeah, what one can check is, are these committees meeting? When there is another visit or another report, are those workers still there? And is there a maintenance of the minutes of meetings? What decisions were taken? Have they been implemented? So yeah.
Okay, thank you. In the meantime, we actually got a question from Martina Trunsknach. She's saying, thank you for your presentation. These are really practical steps public buyers can take, but usually suppliers they are in touch with are quite far from the manufacturers. What do you think is the best way to go beyond Tier 1 to understand freedom of association issues in production countries?
Yeah, see, I'm talking about Tier 1. I'm talking about brand companies, owned by brand companies. I'm not talking about just suppliers. Again, I'm not naming the companies, but these are really brand companies, global brand companies. I'm talking about them rather than smaller suppliers. So I think one would look at the Tier 1 itself first. And of course, the next steps. The next steps definitely, if the Tier 1, since they are leaders, they are global brands, and if they show an example, I think they have the power to make their suppliers follow suit, and implement whatever they are trying. I mean, these brand companies are implementing. So the problem is with the brand companies themselves, and not just the supplier companies. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Gopi, for your insights. We now want to shift a bit the focus, but only slightly, and move towards social auditing and how it is grappling with issues of freedom of association. And for that, we're very happy to welcome Aykut Kazanci, who is an very experienced auditor on any supply chain risks. And he has most recently been the director of best practice audit and verification in Walk Free, an NGO dedicated to end modern slavery. Amongst his very long career list of positions, he has worked also as the Eastern Hemisphere manager for the Fair Labor Association. So I could welcome, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Peter. If my sound quality is still not good, I will stop my video. You tell me.
It's much better. It's much better than before, so it's good. Yes.
Okay, please warn me if it is bad, so I will stop my video. Thank you, and thank you for everyone for participating in this online summit on freedom of association. As Peter nicely and briefly said, I'm an auditor for more than about 20 years, visiting factories, training suppliers and audits, engaging buyers. And we know that a major part of defending workers' rights goes to monitoring on or off site. And it's very important how, in this respect, we see freedom of association in the monitoring world, in the auditing world in general. I see it in two different elements. One is a little bit abstract, while the other is more practical. Starting with the abstract level, what is the perspective towards freedom of association among buyers or their auditors, either through their internal teams or contracted through third parties, or even in the best case, the NGOs monitoring the workers' rights around the factories. You know, there is a what we call the benchmarks or standards of workers' rights in every code element, which is more or less 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 elements. So, and these go, you know, in line with the ILO standards or general code of conducts accepted by most major brands, buyers, or workers' rights organizations. To give you an example, health and safety is a major element in all these benchmarks. And if you look at all these reports and audit results and remedial efforts, a lot of effort goes actually to health and safety, which is good. We need workers healthy, we need safe factories, we need to prevent fires or other accidents and so on and so forth. On the other hand, there are two more elements that is about remuneration or compensation and hours of work, which I call them like numerical elements. And another great effort goes to these two elements through buyers and workers' rights auditors or social auditors in general. Because, you know, there's a lot of elements to be checked in these areas, lots of records, lots of documents, and so on and so forth, lots of calculations and negotiations and disagreements and reports and so on. So when you look at most of the audit reports and remedial efforts, I can say that off the top of my head, 70-80% of all the findings and efforts goes to these three elements: health, safety, and compensation hours of work. Whereas we have all other elements, which I sometimes in my own world call like silent elements, because they don't speak too much. The others are too noisy. You know, you get a lot of things from health and safety, compensation hours of work, and all other 5 elements, which start with, obviously, with zero tolerance issues like child labor and forced labor, and goes on to, for example, discrimination, harassment, and freedom of association. And when it comes to especially these last 3 elements and our subject today, freedom of association, I don't see him finding reported or efforts being paid to remedial efforts.
Aykut, your sound is breaking.
You know,
Aykut, your sound is breaking up quite a bit. Perhaps if you turn off the video, that might help. And if you could speak a little bit slower, then it makes it easier for the interpreters.
Okay, I promise to speak slowly to myself too, but I'm also afraid that I will not use time efficiently. How is it now?
It's much better.
Okay. I'm afraid the internet quality where I am now is not very nice. I will try to continue, but if it is too bad or if I am too fast, please feel free to warn me again. So looking at, again, all the audit reports and remedial efforts being paid, you don't see much of freedom of association. And normal objective person from this perspective would think that, well, there isn't much problem about freedom of association in the supplier factories, which we all know that this is not true. actually it's a trivial result that we see all the audit reports or results of monitoring all these years, 30 or so years, showing not much about freedom of association, either in terms of issues or interview results, or also remedial efforts. So one would think, is this just an administrative requirement? Is it just a policy statement that we are expecting from supplier factories? Or especially when there is no union of workers in a factory, just a few and tick auditor and reported.
Aykut, you're breaking off.
Reflect that
Aykut?
Most suppliers.
Aykut, we can't hear. We
Yes,
can hear
I'm
you,
here.
but we can't understand you for the last 20 to 30 seconds.
Okay, I see.
Oh, it's still very bad. We just hear glimpses of your words. Are you there, Aykut? Oh, it seems you are, but so we can't hear you at all right now. It's just small snippets of sound that we can hear.
Okay. So we will probably stop.
Well, now it's getting better, obviously. It's as usual, but maybe you try and we'll just see how far we can get.
Maybe I change my position in where I am a bit.
Oh, always helpful. Even if it's just... Now it's better, yes.
Okay, I will try. Also, here you are. Okay, I will try again.
Mm-hmm.
All right. So let me repeat what I just within the last 20, 30 seconds. I was mentioned that looking at the audit reports and results.
Sorry, I could to interrupt you again. It's really, unfortunately, it didn't help.
Okay.
That's
so maybe
what I would propose is that we may want to just move on to Stine, and if and then we will try to get you on back at the end of the call, of the webinar, and maybe you have up until then better Wi-Fi or mobile network. Would this be a solution?
great.
Okay.
Yes,
okay, sorry about that, but the internet is not helpful here right now. Okay, thank you, Aykut. I think what was kind of clear, at least from me, and I obviously had a pre-talk with Aykut, is that there is a lot of going on with things that you can measure, which are even then a challenge, but that on issues like freedom of association, social audits don't invest a lot of time and don't invest and don't provide an overview. And with this, if you don't know what is happening, you can't push for improvements. So let's move maybe now as a stopgap here, move on and move to Stine Foss and move with this a bit from the challenges of monitoring and auditing for freedom of association to the perspective of public buyers. We have invited Stine Foss from the city of Oslo, who is working there as the Sustainability Manager Ethical Trade. Stine has more than 10 years of experience with the Ethical Trade Initiative in Norway and is specialized in sustainable supply chains. Stine,
Yes.
welcome. Can you share your screen with us, or do we have to make you?
Let's see. Do you hear me okay?
I can hear you okay, and we can see your screen. So I will mute myself, and the floor is yours.
Thank you. Let's see. No, just missing the screen here. Okay, so thank you. I'm Stine Foss, as you said, and I work as a sustainability manager in the city of Oslo. And I'm responsible for ethical trade and basically human rights in the supply chain. And I started in February this year. So the experience that I'm talking about today, obviously I haven't followed it all the way, but I'll go through it with you. I'll just start a little bit with the Oslo and procurements in Oslo. The city purchases for goods and services for approximately 1.8 billion euros annually. And we do have a decentralized procurement model, which means that all those squares that you see on the right is responsible for their own procurements, except the citywide framework agreements, which is the Agency for Improvement and Development, where I'm sitting. We are responsible for those citywide framework agreements, and we're trying to do make quite a lot of those. And the one that I'm talking about today is workwear, which is one of those, and also ICT equipment is also one of those citywide framework agreements where we buy for about 40 million euros annually. And we do have standard social selection criteria and contract clauses that we use in high risk procurements of goods, and that's about 50%, or it was 50% of all procurements in 2020. And today I'm going to talk about our procurement an agreement that we have on workwear. This is a citywide framework agreement, as I said, and that's obviously we're with Electronics Watch. So the interesting is not that we bought a lot of T-shirts, but it's obviously the criteria that we used in this agreement that hopefully can be interesting in ICT procurements as well. So when we were to do this procurement, my colleagues did a risk of human rights breaches, and it was clear that we obviously had to use our standard social selection criteria and contract clauses, but they also saw that especially the T-shirts and the textile products of this agreement for procurement would come from China, where they also saw that freedom of association is not legal, and so there has to be other measures to kind of take care of that issue. And I thought I could send you, after someone asked before that, how can you get an overview? And I was just thinking that International Trade Union Confederation, they come out with a global index every year of these issues. And that's a really good start to get an overview of what's the issues with freedom of association and other labor right issues in production countries and everywhere. So I can send that link afterwards. So just a little bit about the standard social criteria and follow-up first. We use what we call social selection criteria to where we ask for a management system and a system for traceability of human rights and labor rights in the supply chain. And that's to ensure that the suppliers that we do get a contract with have or are admitted to the competition are able to fulfill the social contract clauses. And the actual social contract clauses, which they sign when they get the contract, is based on ILO conventions, which probably you've seen before, which also include freedom of association and collective bargaining. And in general, we do have follow-up contracts and suppliers with the what I tried to put the figure on the right again. It's based a lot on dialogue, but it's also based on document review and our own desktop research. And we do have a self-assessment questionnaire that we send to all suppliers. And we do some audits of the suppliers' systems to deal with these issues, and also audits on production sites. But in this case, with workwear, we added an additional contract clause on social dialogue. And this is just an unofficial translation, so please don't refer to it as the actual one that was set in the contract. But in this, the supplier was obliged to implement measures for social dialogue at factory level. And this was in China. And the measures should be designed to ensure lasting improvements. And it was also a goal that measures was to aim to provide workers with increased knowledge about the rights, the roles, and the responsibility in the workplace, as well as to contribute to increased worker representation and better dialogue between management and workers. And the next sentence, it was an explanation of one such tool is something called Quizzer, just to give the suppliers an idea of what this could mean, because this was the first time the suppliers saw this kind of requirements. And we also had the last sentence that the measures should be implemented no later than within 6 months. And also and the supplier should, in dialogue with the client, determine the scope of these measures. So dialogue was also important because this was a new criteria, so to say. And this started in 2018, this contract, and is about to finish now in 2022. So what we did to follow up was send a self-assessment questionnaire, as we always do. However, it was not sufficient answers in the self-assessment questionnaire. And that's why we had a lot of dialogue with the supplier. And we didn't get answers if they started implement these measures or what was the intention, which resulted in an audit in April 2020, and that was an audit of the supplier in Norway. So to see if they had systems in place that were good enough to work with the ILO conventions, and particularly this project, or these measures that they should take, or they were required to take on social dialogue. And the audit found that they hadn't really started on anything, which was, as you see, that was in 2020, so that was 2 years after the start of it. But that audit made it quite clear that they had to start changing the management system and start with implementing these measures. So we had quite a lot of dialogue as well to get that started. And they did. So they had what they call kind of a project, because this was totally new for them. And perhaps they didn't see it coming, but so they started this project in 2020, and they handed us the report, the final report, and now just in November 2021. And we will continue to have dialogue, both on the report on social dialogue, but also on their management systems in general. So the results of the implementation of social dialogue in China was they chose 2 factories based on their risk assessments and in dialogue with us. It was 2 rather small factories, especially compared to ICT industry, where I mentioned they're quite a lot bigger than these 2. The first factory was a wool textiles with 44 employees, and they started a program with a network called TAOS, and they had meeting with management and workers and on-site training and corrective action points. So that was a trainer that came to the factory and had both training and dialogue with management and workers. And the aim was to help acquire knowledge and to integrate implementation of the social compliance in routines and processes. And what they did do is that they assisted in a democratically elected worker representation, because the trainers saw that they had worker representation, but it was elected by the factory owner. So that was a focus for this factory, is how to have an actual election democratically elected by workers. And that was kind of their main takeaway from the project. And they had some worker meetings or meetings with the worker and the management, where they get some new agreements with the management after that election. And the second factory was a cotton textiles, a bit bigger, 98 employees, and they used the digital tool called Quizzer, which we refer to in the contract, and that's a digital training. So they had digital training on rights and responsibilities, worker engagement, wage management systems. And what you could see with this type of project is that we could see a verification of the training. You could see how many workers did the training, and because it's based on like a quiz, you don't just accept, you have to answer questions and actually learn on the way. So you can see how many have actually understood their rights and responsibilities. And that was the two projects, so to say, that they did. And our learnings was that the first one is that it's necessary to follow up on social contract clauses. I think both our standard social contract clauses has been a part of tenders for so long that they kind of loses their meaning. And also when we did this specific criteria and social dialogue, it's even more important to kind of follow up and see, go together with the supplier to see change. And the second point is exactly that we need an effective dialogue and collaboration with the supplier to achieve results. It's our experience is that on these matters that are kind of it's difficult. We don't have, the supplier doesn't have the answers. We don't have the answers, so we have to go the way together to see what's possible. Another learning was that it's compared to our standard contract clauses where you kind of look for breaches in this criteria, the supplier had to do actual measures, so we could see the positive measures. So they have to do take action on something, which is kind of a different approach than the standard social criteria that we use. Regarding the formulation of the criteria, perhaps we would have done it differently the next time, or could it be used in a different ways? But in either way, it was very useful to test the criteria and get that experience from the two, also because they did two different ways of, they had two different approaches to solve or to take measures on social dialogue, and it seemed like they could be useful both approaches, which is again something to learn from other suppliers or other public buyers, and that was useful. And it's possible to do it that way, which is also a positive experience. And the question at bottom is, will we see lasting change because of it? Maybe, maybe not. And that's, at least we've discussed that it had to be based, or you have to also look at the supplier's management systems in general, not only one concrete project. If the supplier has a really good management systems to work with social issues in the supply chain, I would think that one of these projects would be even more useful and be perhaps more lasting. And the supplier said it was useful, but expensive. And our next step is that we're working towards criteria on human rights diligence even more. We will get a new legislation for human rights due diligence in Norway that will start next summer. So we're setting our criteria even to be even more concrete on what these systems should look like, that the suppliers need to follow up on these issues. And we're also gaining more and closer following up with in-house competence, because I think we need both capacity and competence of these issues to be able to follow up and set criteria in the right way, and also focus on guidance and training for our suppliers to be able to meet our criteria. And that was it. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Stine. Thank you for this very open and detailed account, because I think that's really a example where we all can learn from. First, that you can actually ask, and that you should be asking, but that as usual, the devil is in the detail and in the implementation. It's always about implementation. And we do have received many questions already for you. So I would just read out them one by one, and we can also take them to our later discussion, but you might want to answer some of them. So the first one is from Bernard Go. He's asking, would it be feasible to monitor suppliers only through union feedback or other social dialogue mechanisms and without social audits? So do you see a potential to speak directly to trade unions, basically?
Yes, or both yes and no. I guess much of our equipment comes from China, and that's the main market. So there's no, yeah, so it depends on how you can use trade union there, obviously. But I think it's absolutely relevant to see how to use trade unions in a better ways rather than audits, because I don't think it's necessary to have a lot of audits just to say that you have done an audit, which is basically today. But yes, perhaps. I'm positive.
Yeah. Okay. And the last question actually in the list links to that. It's from Isabelle Barthes, who will talk in a brief second. She's asking, how do you involve national trade union? I mean, the Norwegian. Have you involved them in this process, or do you plan maybe to involve them?
Not. I don't think they've been involved particularly in this one, but we do have close dialogue with the union based on our standard criteria. Mm-hmm. And in some, yeah, but our national unions know most about national, what happens in Norway, obviously. Mm. So we have really close dialogue there. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you. But you know, this is kind of the discussion that I have been running in my head a bit about the idea of basically an international trade union clearinghouse where public buyers can actually turn to and can ask, look, we have this factory in our supply chain. What do you know about this factory from a union side? Please tell us, because we don't want to make a social audit. We want to ask you as a union.
Yeah, I agree. And I think we've actually discussed that as well. If it was Aykut or, you know, international trade union, that mm-hmm. could be, I guess it's more relevant for these questions, because like a Norwegian office don't have all the knowledge of all settings around the world. So I agree, that would be good.
So that's a good learning point. We have another question from our colleague in Hong Kong, Ao. What are the roles of the democratically elected worker representatives? Do you know about this? Do they find their participation improve the working conditions in the factory? Are there any difficulties in carrying out the dialogue with suppliers in China in recent years?
Well, I could say about this factory is it seemed that they didn't really know that it should be democratically elected. So the management just elected someone, and that's just how it was. So it seemed that it wasn't too much problem to actually get a democratically elected, especially when this trainer was on board and could kind of follow the process. And they did have a meeting where they got, I don't remember exactly what it was, but it was something with parking that the workers were which was important to them. And that's the point, right? They thought that issue was relevant, and they discussed it with management, and that was fine. So that's kind of the point, that you could actually get the workers' voice to the table with management, whatever the issues they feel is most important. But this was we just got the report just in November, so if this will be lasting. Will there be issues on the way? Perhaps.
I think that's a big question also, not only, I mean, a big question is already how to know what is happening. And then the super big question is how to know if it's sustainably impacting.
Yeah.
We have a question from Hiroko Kakinohana, who asks, could you tell us a bit more about the audit of suppliers? What do you exactly do?
So we're trying to revise this again because we're getting in-house competence on this field. Before we use external agencies, and we think that that's not sustainable as well. Just we need this in-house competence to look at these issues. What we do is we very much use the human rights due diligence methodology. That's from OECD particularly. That's we're working on, where it's quite clear. They have like a 6-step model, what should be in place. And we're trying to breaking that up to quite precisely parts, so that one is commitment and policies. The second one is risk assessment. And they have concrete information on how that would be. So that will actually look at the system, see how it is. Not just do you have a system, but what is it? And also to be able to discuss what they see as the salient issues. And I think we can use that today, that a lot of our suppliers, I guess, who's not so mature would say health and safety, because that comes out with audits, but because we have enough knowledge to know that, well, you haven't even mentioned freedom of association and you're in China. That doesn't work. So it's a lot of, that's why I say learning and guidance is important, because it's a new way of thinking, and we're a stakeholder in their risk assessment. So that's also a good way to give input in improving those systems. But then we need competence, obviously, to be able to have that dialogue with our suppliers. Yeah.
Thank you. And as a last point, it's not a question, it's just a raving review from Jim Cranshaw, who is writing, after over a decade working in this space, this is one of the most exciting developments I've seen. Thanks for sharing, Stine. So much social auditing dances around the issue of the real meaningful rights around freedom of association, collective bargaining, democratic representations, unions forming, discrimination, harassment, etc. Whilst we are all learning on our feet here, it shows that it is possible for public procurement. Spending power can promote this more substantive rights and outcomes. So again, thank you very much for your great work, and thank you for sharing.
Thank you.
And let's maybe try once again with Aykut and see if his internet connection has improved. Aykut.
Hi, Peter.
Hello, it sounds a bit better. Let's see. How about you try in the next 10 minutes to tell us if your points, if we can't hear you, I will tell you so. Okay. Now.
I will.
Okay. Okay, it really seems that
Right.
Unfortunately, it seems that we have you have really a bad connection today, because I couldn't understand anything you said now. I'm really sorry. We probably will have to do this another day, because I think the insights from an experienced auditor on what is actually happening on the floor, on the factory floor, is really very central to understanding what kind of issues do we see in the system and what can be done about this. So Isabelle, I would like to invite you now. You are you were planned as our last input here. Now we kind of, because of the issues with the internet, What we wanted to bring in this discussion is obviously also a perspective of the trade unions, because we are talking about freedom of association. So a trade union perspective is really essential for us, and especially also one from the global north. Isabelle Barthes is the Deputy General Secretary at IndustriAll Europe. She's currently in charge of collective bargaining and social policy activities at IndustriAll Europe, also for aerospace, ICT and defense industries, as well as youth and social dialogue in metal, engineering and technology-based industries. So Isabelle, if I could invite you to share your views on what you have heard today and what your perspective on public procurement as a tool to really push for unionization and freedom of association can be.
Thank you, Peter. And sorry, my voice is better, but not completely back. Well, thank you very much for the invitation, and good morning, colleagues. I have to say that the intervention of the three, sorry again, for the three previous speakers was extremely interesting for me, because I mean, I got a perspective of the practitioners, actually those on the ground that are either the buyers are setting the clauses, but also those who are checking, verifying the implementation of these clauses, whereas we are much more remote from this situation. Actually, we are the one, in a way, trying to push, to lobby for the legislation that hopefully will help them on the ground, actually. And just a couple of words about our organization, because we are representing many sectors, actually, and we are covering manufacturing industry from energy, from coal mining, to textile, to metal, to chemicals. And just to echo what Gupina said, it is clear that what we call in our organization the ICT sector, the electronic sector, is one of the most difficult sector in terms of unionization. We have low unionization. We often have very aggressive employers compared to sectors that traditionally are more open to social dialogue, thinking of the steel industry or even the automotive industry. So it's also a reality that we have to face with here in Europe. Also, the question of the supply chain and fighting for trade union rights within the supply chain is also an issue for Europe. I mean, and I would say it's almost a day-to-day fight. So it's, of course, you have this north and south perspective, but things are not so easy in the north either. And just to give you a couple of ideas of what we are doing, because I think this is important in this discussion, and I would also like to share with you some of the prospects that we are seeing for the future. So in some sectors like textile, I mean, we are extensively cooperating at European level with NGOs, actually, to ensure a fair trade practice in multinational companies. I mean, we have a long-standing cooperation in these sectors, also with our global sister organization, IndustriAll Global. The other also point of key demand that we have had now for many years is sustainable corporate governance. I mean, we are pushing, we are demanding mandatory due diligence at European level, and we were almost close to get it, because the Commission, the European Commission, had announced that it will publish an initiative in this direction. So we have heavily lobbying for what we wanted, especially we were calling for mandatory due diligence, but also mandatory reporting. And in view of what we've been saying, this is extremely important. So both making companies accountable, but also ensuring transparency. And unfortunately, we didn't know yet what the Commission had in mind, because the Commission, often we have some leaked version of the draft proposal, but this time the Commission has been extremely secretive. So the question was also, where does the public sector stand? Because it's always an issue in EU legislation. The public sector is always treated differently when you think, for instance, in terms of information and consultation rights. So I'm not able to tell you whether the public sector was going to be part of that initiative. But the bad news is that we've heard yesterday that the proposal was postponed, and with actually no new date for publication, which brings us to say that there has been very aggressive lobbying coming from multinational companies. And this is bad, actually, because, Europe should be in a position to promote social dialogue also outside of Europe, and this is a golden opportunity to do it. The other point also where we are involved in the domestic advisory group that are established in connection with free trade agreements, and for you in particular, the one on Vietnam that has just been met for the first time 2 weeks ago. So we are also part of that. And this is also one area where we discussed labor rights, supply chain, and due diligence. And of course, the other topic that we've been discussing here is public procurement, that you would say is could be the low-hanging fruit in Europe, because in countries where you have clear legal support for social dialogue, for trade union rights, you would imagine that in their public procurement policy, government would actually integrate it into their policy, which is not actually the case. I mean, it's more about international competition and low price procurement than promoting workers' rights. And so this is why we've been very active as trade union to change the existing regulation on public procurement. There is actually a campaign going on, which is run by one of our sister organizations in Europa, demanding collective bargaining in public procurement. So in preventing companies to get to access to public funding if they don't have a collective agreement in their company. So of course, that would be a very powerful tool. What is interesting as well for you to know, and I'm sorry for my voice, is that there is a big debate and a proposal of a directive in Europe which concerns minimum wage and the promotion of collective bargaining. And also in that proposal, there is a clear reference on the role of public procurement in supporting collective bargaining. This is actually still a proposal, and we have to see where we land on this one, because it's clear that there is also fierce opposition from some countries and also from the employers. What I would like also to flag up with you is what I call the prospect for public procurement in the ICT sector, which is linked to the recovery plan. You know, this massive plan that the EU has adopted. It's called the resilience and recovery facility, where there is an obligation for a country to earmark 20% of their spending in digital investment. And if you look at some countries like Germany, the total amount of these 20% were actually dedicated to digitization of public administration. So basically, this will translate into public procurement. So there we see also an opportunity to push, because we can expect more spending for public administration in the future. So we see also an opportunity there to make sure that the public procurement that or the contract that are made by those governments are made with companies that respect trade union rights. And of course, the resilience and recovery facility is one aspect, but we also should look at the big prospect of the greening of the Green Deal and the greening of the society. The carbon neutrality. That there again will trigger lots of public investment. I will stop here and I'm available for questions.
Thank you, Isabelle, for this great overview. And what I think, or for me, it becomes clear is that on one, there is a increasing cooperation between trade unions in the global north, between campaigns, civil society organizations in the global north and the global south. And this is actually what we need to see. We need to see a complex network of various organizations to be able to tackle these issues that are coming up in these supply chains that are global and that are also complex. Before we try to jump into questions, I would like to try for a last time with Aykut, because he wrote that he changed now his setup and maybe his sound is better. Aykut.
Yes, I changed the laptop and I don't know if you can hear me.
We can hear you well, and please go on.
Okay, so maybe I will try to wrap up in less than 10 minutes. Okay, what I was trying to say is actually most of it was actually discussed by the speaker after me from Norway. And most of what I would like to say is actually completing that same perspective, actually. There is a lot of social auditing done, and there is a lot of things gathered about really tangible elements, really visible elements, from numbers, from working hours to health and safety issues, and so on and so forth. But some of the equally, well, at least equally sensitive and important elements, such as freedom of association, is not showing up in social audits reports and remedial efforts. And this is actually in contrary to what actually the right of freedom of association can grant to workers in the workplace. If you can think about how the supplier companies can in fact create mechanisms to resolve all the code elements that most of the buyers' brands are sensitive about, from child labor to safety issues to compensation, to hours of work, to subcontracting, temporary workers, and so on and so forth. If you can imagine, for example, if you can visualize a collective bargaining agreement at the end of the long way of freedom of association and joining and forming trade unions in a workplace, that would actually take care of all the compliance rights that we are all trying to resolve. So if you think about from this perspective that this one single element is actually so powerful and capable of creating the workplace rights in the workplace, both from a theoretical and practical perspective, whereas we are all struggling to eliminate all these issues in isolations, one by one, safety issues, child labor issues, everybody is sensitive about forced labor, modern slavery, and so on and so forth. But, you know, the right of forming or joining trade unions and agreeing collectively, negotiating and bargaining collectively with the employers is actually trying to do the same in more internal and day-to-day mechanisms rather than snapshots, audits, or interviews. So if we can change the perspective of thinking the social compliance elements among buyers, brands, auditors, everybody in this field, I think this will really make sense because I personally would like to see auditors, at least, or buyers and influential managers in the workplaces to see the freedom of association as a zero tolerance element, not as an administrative requirement, not as an abstract requirement that we just want to resolve through a policy statement or a checklist question. It's really a zero tolerance element. But as you also pointed out, right, Peter, there are also tangible things to reach that ultimate goal, joining or forming trade unions. And I think, again, the speaker from Oslo also pointed out very well, and she gave examples of how this can be achieved by simple elements. For example, democratically elected worker representatives in many countries and in most of the suppliers. This is still not a simple right that could be achieved with today's emphasis and today's perspective. Meeting through workers' committees, creating dialogue mechanisms through human resource departments or other floor managers, or result creating training, for example, awareness training, not just trainings. But, again, from a monitoring perspective, these are all known elements. It's not a surprise that we need to really encourage workers to speak for themselves and so on and so forth. But again, from a monitoring perspective, from either snapshot by snapshot visits or remotely monitoring these, we're just looking at the documents and records and trying to understand if these rights are being granted. I think we need to really look into the tissues of these processes. For instance, it can be done in a social audit that the auditors would like to see a workers' committee in operation, in actual function, rather than asking questions and checking procedures and records. They can actually like to see a workers' committee in meeting and how they are communicating with the managers. Or if you're in a factory where the whole social dialogue is summarized into an array of suggestion boxes that the management claims that as a functioning a communication tool, which is not. You may like to see any suggestion within the last 3 years, and if the result is none, then this is really a trivial, again, a mechanism that is just being used as a tick in the box. So my examples or my advice for all the people who are in the monitoring or auditing world, either on-site or off-site, we would like to change the mindset of the importance of freedom of association. Plus, we would like to see the actual processes working through interviews, through observations, through real questions to understand if the communication, consultation, negotiation mechanisms are actually working there. So this was, these 2 points were my whole advice to anyone who would like to do something more in the field of freedom of association. Please elevate its importance from just being a silent compliance element from an abstract ILO requirements, which is rarely observed, to a importance, to a position which really tells the suppliers that it is a very important thing. It's actually on and above all other elements because it can actually govern all elements alone by automatic internal mechanisms. So this is one change of mindset. And the other is, in order to reach into that ultimate goal of allowing workers to form or join trade unions. Try to see the tangible steps working in the workplace. And again, the speaker from Oslo gave a lot of examples that it is possible to actually create these steps. And I think this is the summary of what I was going to say in about 20 minutes.
Thank you, Aykut, for this really focused run through, because I think that this was really, really important. And what struck me as a there are these kind of these practical things. There are these things that specific groups can do. I mean, an audit is not something a public procurer can do, but what a public buyer can do is drive the mindset change. So that freedom of association is not something that is also in the list, but that it is actually a central thing that we as public buyers will want you to provide with details on it, that it is important. And obviously the Oslo example is an example of how to do it, and that it is important. It is challenging. It is challenging for the public buyers. It is challenging for the contractor. It is challenging for the supply chain. But it changes how it is perceived. It changes that this is not just another contractual condition, but it is something that actually needs to be done. So I think public buyers can do a lot about this. There is a question, and I would actually ask you, Alistair Smith, to maybe, if you are open, to unmute yourself and ask this question, because I think it needs a bit of framing of what you want to know, because the question is basically, presence of democratically elected workers' representations or workers' committees can undermine the emergence of an independent trade union. And I would actually like to understand the mechanisms here that you think are driving this.
Yeah, thank you. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can.
Yeah, great. No, I just think our experience from the agro-industrial world, which is not the same as ICT or textiles, is that the push in the absence of trade unions to set up a workers' committee often happens because there are real restrictions on freedom of association by employers. They don't want independent trade unions because they don't want them present, and they don't want to bargain with them. So the push by some buyers to set up workers' committees under various names with democratic elections creates a body that actually may make it more difficult for the union that's been trying to organise in that space, so in that factory plantation. It may make it more difficult than if there were nothing at all. That's certainly our experience.
Yes.
And that's without going into fair trade type committees that are required to manage premium for fair trade and things like that. But
And I think 2 points were made during both Gopi's presentation and Stine's presentation. Gopi basically developed this or proposed this idea of, we need to have a roadmap. Public buyers need to know that's only one step in the entire process, and we need to check what kind of roadmaps have the factories actually to offer to push for going beyond and not basically keeping still at one development point. And then there was this big question that also Stine posed, is how do we make sure that this is sustainable and that it actually has a positive impact? So yes, I do see your point, and yes, that's basically the challenging thing here. We are actually at the end of the hour, but before, so what I would do is I would propose to end this meeting here. And I will continue a bit after I have ended this meeting here. Thank you for all participants, and thank you for all speakers. This was really, really super interesting, and I think we have a great discussion here. I just want to invite you to our next and tomorrow's last meeting of our Freedom of Association Summit. It will be on the question of remediation, which is a central question. And with this, I would end this meeting. But as I announced, we are going to have another half an hour where we can discuss in a much less formal way your questions.